And again, I think all of our listeners, if they have a phone or if they've sent an email, have interacted with this infrastructure, but they maybe don't necessarily know what it encompasses. So can you speak to maybe the terminology behind all of this?
Absolutely. And I like that you phrased it that way because it's often how I talk about digital infrastructure to those not in this space, especially somebody like my just newly minted 16-year-old stepson. He just turned 16 yesterday. And when we talk about this, I'm like, are you using your phone? Are you on, Spotify? Are you using any of the streaming services? Because he's sort of familiar, like we all are, with the buzzword of the cloud. But the cloud is in a physical space. It really is rooted in digital infrastructure in the sense that your data centers house it. You have a lot of things like cabling, whether it's subsea or your power cabling, getting into the space and kind of getting the equipment up and running, which then, you know, puts together what we see again on the back end or the front end, if you will, again, our videos or our music or anything like that. It really is the foundation for everything in the digital economy, it businesses, people connecting all of us. I know that that sounds very wide ranging, but it really is. Your medical records that you access when you're at a doctor's visit, when you're on your credit card and you're looking at your statement, all of this comes through that broader digital infrastructure space. I mean, our work when it comes to sustainability tends to focus on the brick and mortar of it, meaning the actual buildings of the data centers. But as I said, there's so much more that really relates to anything else that we think about in our daily lives when we're looking and working, no matter how intense or less so we are in space. I hope that gave some clarity to what we're talking about.
So then I would love to dive in a little bit more into your specific role. You work for an organization called the iMasons, which I would love if you could dive into that specifically. And then within your role, you are really focused on the climate accord that is an integral part of the organization. So for those who are less familiar with it, could you help catch our listeners up to speed on those two different concepts?
Sure. The iMasons or Infrastructure Masons, so iMasons for short, is a global nonprofit. It's been around almost a decade for professionals in the digital infrastructure space. It really connects everyone from front end delivery partners, so those in like engineering, architecture, construction, again, for the data centers, to the big tech players in this space. So Meta, Microsoft, Google, AWS, and it runs the gamut everywhere in between. We kind of touched on it a little bit. Those that serve the power sources, those that are in government and regulatory frameworks, and the iMasons themselves are individuals. Those are the members of the iMasons with four pillars that they really tend to look at. So technology or innovation, education, and kind of what the workforce pipeline is going forward with, inclusion, which also stems out to veterans workforce, those coming from the armed forces, as well as women. And then, of course, last but not least, sustainability. And so the sustainability pillar and those really kind of all ingrained on this, which is all of them, sat down with our Global Advisory Council about 3 years ago now, realizing how much more responsibility they had towards the actions of climate change and our world, our environment, and launched the initiative called the Climate Accord, which is, as you noted, what I run now. This is a space where now our members are companies, almost 300 of them, with the goal of being on a carbon reduction journey. The ultimate target is net zero carbon emissions as outlined in the Paris Climate Accord, hence why it's called the Climate Accord. And we're really making strides when we talk and look at all of our initiatives around power, equipment, and materials.
In all other areas of business, it feels like we're so competitive. But when it comes to sustainability, and you probably feel this when you go to a sustainability conference, it feels like we are all in this together. So while your businesses might be competitors, we recognize we have a common goal. And so that kind of overrides the, I guess, bottom line only approach of being competition and makes us really realize that there's such deep value in collaboration. And I know collaboration is really a key concept to iMason's Climate Accord. Could you speak to that a little bit further? Because especially when you see some of the groups that you're working with, I think in every other way, they're probably competitors, but you're bringing them together for this incredible work.
I love that question, and I love that that's what you're taking away from kind of our early discussions and look at the climate accord itself. It is one of our core tenets, this collaborative effort with kind of paired with transparency, that these companies and organizations realize, as we like to say, it's a team sport. That it's not going to get done alone, no matter how big of a company you are, no matter how many resources you have. These are things that work together, and when they don't really work in counter to each other, to drive things like emissions reductions or energy efficiency or resource efficient resource use. And so there are a number of examples that we could get into. This last year, though, has been, for me, quite exciting to see how much they're taking that concept to heart. We were even in a session recently at the Yada 24 conference in Las Vegas, on the main stage. And that main stage panel included Schneider Electric, Google, Microsoft, and Meta. And oftentimes, to your point about them being competitors, they sometimes are, or again, they work in spaces that overlap. To see them all on stage talking about these issues together, really sort of felt like a great moment and a warm moment that, yeah, this is now everyone gets that message clearly.
And it's so important too, I think, with the power of that level of organization too, to bring the brightest minds together of trying to find solutions. And I know one of the solutions that your organization is trying to think through is finding a common methodology, or at least an approach, when it comes to emissions reductions. And I know when we're talking about the digital infrastructure space, that is often a concern that gets bubbled up, is as we're using them more and more, is this going to result into an increase in emissions? And I think if we go status quo, it would. However, with all of these organizations trying to find those solutions and the common methodology, that seems to be an important piece in the conversations.
To be fair, a lot of companies have been very honest with their public,
Mm.
especially in the last 6 months or year, that emissions are going up, which I appreciate. In the past, we've seen funny math or avoidance of the topic, or just trying to, kind of skirt around an issue when it comes to these questions. And if you look at a half a dozen ESG reports over the last year, as I said, you'll notice that they have put in their report, we are up 30%, 40% over the baselines that we set, that at this point we should be seeing going the other way. And that is large in part to how much digital infrastructure is growing right now. It is at a very rapid pace. A lot of it has to do with generative AI. And to that, all that notion, again, the Climate Accord launched prior to generative AI. And yet now we're seeing this acceleration of it. And so two pieces of work that I'm really proud of, and are set to launch in January, which is a maturity model. And this is coming from all of our members that have worked together to look at those three areas I noted before: power, equipment, and materials. And what are the various levels and tiers that companies should be striving to get to when they are looking at their climate change solutions and, again, their public commitments. And then the second part is a project and collaboration we have started in last January, with the Open Compute Foundation. And this has to do with actual kind of carbon disclosure labels. It's really part and parcel to Open Compute Foundation's area of equipment. And so that is kind of one of those big black holes right now when you're trying to report on your scope 3 emissions, the materials in the equipment, again, how much power they're using, et cetera, et cetera. And so we're, really diving into kind of both of those two pieces of work to ensure that, again, there's a roadmap for anyone who joins us and is on this journey with us together.
So you mentioned equipment, materials, and power. And you have working groups dedicated to looking at these three different topics. Maybe we can take one at a time, just to help our listeners better understand some of the good work that is happening in each of these spaces. And I'm just personally very curious. From an equipment standpoint, when you're looking at that within the digital infrastructure, is that specific to trying to get better energy efficiency, or what do those conversations look like, and where are you trying to dive in deeper with your members?
All of the above. When we talk about equipment, we really are looking at both IT equipment, so servers, processors, what you would find in the data center itself in the data halls, and then of course MEP equipment. How are we cooling and heating these spaces? And that's my background, the built environment. So I get really nerded out on what's going on in the systems on that front. And then luckily I have so many experts that know what's going on in the tech space and the IT space that they bring that, and then we kind of bring it all together. So the goal for that equipment pillar is really the decarb of both, again, the materials that are going into it and the efficiencies and the processes that are serving on that. When we're talking about the materials, it's the brick and mortar of the facilities that we look at. And so sometimes I'll chat with people and say, like, yes, it's great that your equipment's efficient. If your building envelope isn't performing, then it almost doesn't matter. You're trying to band-aid a solution by over doing, again, the sizing of the equipment or looking at it in ways that can be a lot more holistic and kind of almost communicating within its own space. If your building envelope's great, then of course you have better ways to manage the humidity, the cooling, again, the heating, those kinds of things coming out of the equipment. And then when you're talking about the power, it's really the power that sources all of this, looking at clean power, green power, renewables. I say these separately because for a lot of people and a lot of organizations, these do mean different things. Something like nuclear, not renewable necessarily, but it is a cleaner source. The emissions are much lower than something like a traditional oil and gas or coal. And then when you talk about renewables, we're talking solar, we're talking, you know, windmills, we're talking, those kinds of traditional renewable sources that most people are familiar with. The one thing that I will say is that with all of these cases, resources are limited. We have a finite amount of resources. So how we can be better about using any one of these pillars and ultimately all of them together is going to drive that emission reduction the other way versus what we're seeing in that growth of it or the increase in it.
And one of those areas too, specific to the materials, I've been seeing this more and more, and I think in speaking with different guests from Europe, it seems like it's almost common practice, and it's coming now to North America, is environmental product disclosures. And so for our listeners who are less familiar with this concept, it is really the idea that as you are sourcing different materials or looking at the environmental details about the individual products. And I believe it is Meta that recently came out and said that they are looking for all of their suppliers to start providing this information. Is that something you're seeing more and more? And is that part of that transparency journey?
We do see more of it. It's not at the place that we need it to be. We even actually issued, coming from the governing body this year. So my governing body is made up of Meta, Google, AWS, Microsoft, Digital Realty, and Schneider Electric. They all in July signed an open letter and call to action on EPDs. And the reason for that is, and you've noted a little bit with Europe, we need third-party declarations and we need third-party verification of the information that we are reporting on and going into our buildings. And without that, it effectively becomes greenwashing. There is no source of truth behind the information that we're reporting on. There is no baseline to indicate this is why these are, apples to apples comparisons. Instead, we're seeing various methodologies, various calculations, not using the same databases. It goes on. And some of this is we just need the information. So oftentimes an APD, while it comes from an LCA, so a life cycle analysis or a life cycle assessment, depending on who you're talking to, which looks at factors like resource use, waste generation, emission, transportation of materials, that gets compiled into the EPD, third party verified and published. That's an enormous process. If you can kind of hear that in the process itself, just saying it in a very simplified way, it takes time, it takes a cost, it takes energy and effort. If those EPDs don't pass the test, your LCA doesn't pass the test, and companies get concerned that they don't look great. They don't look up to snuff. Sometimes they don't share all of that information. And so it's part of what we're trying to kind of break through. Nobody is perfect at this right now. Nobody is doing this 100% wrong. We are all in kind of a place where we need to be better, back to your point about collaboration, better about collaborating on it so we can understand what we don't know and what we do know and be better about it when we bring all of that together in terms of comparisons, building assessments, certifications, or in the case right now, EPDs, and getting the information out there.